We're going to get started here. You'll be able to tell what generation I'm from when I say it's time to rock and roll here. My name is Bill Bronson. I'm privileged to serve as the Vice President of the Lewis and Clark Trail Heritage Foundation, and I'm equally privileged to be the moderator for today's program. I want to mention a few housekeeping things before I introduce our speakers. First and foremost, this is important to me, and I've noticed this has been an issue the last few days. If you happen to be one of those souls who carries around one of these little... Can you hear me now? Good. All right. If you carry one of these little demonic devices known as cell phones, please turn them off as a courtesy not only to our speakers, but also to the other folks in attendance here today. Another thing, too, equally important, you will probably see, if you have not seen them already, survey cards that are provided by Travelers Rest Connection. We ask that you please complete those and get them back to the registration desk, or my wife Carol will try to collect them before the proceedings are fully concluded today. These survey cards are very important, not only to Travelers Rest in terms of their future programming, but also to the Trail Heritage Foundation, because if you are a member, you know that we put on these events every year. We plan them usually 2, sometimes 3 years out, and we like to know what type of interest you have as attendees, and we want to make sure we can replicate those in other locations around the United States. Before actually doing the introduction, I'm going to read to you the land acknowledgement. You've probably heard one or more versions of this the last few days. I certainly hope that you all take this version or any version that you might hear to heart, and not just simply render it part of your monotonic recitations in your catalog of such things. Please give these the respect that they are due. They are part of a long process of healing for all of our peoples. It's a process that will take generations to complete. And if you attach as much significance to this as you do many of the other great sayings we have as a people, they will mean much more. And they should always be read and understood as more than just a cheap gesture to our indigenous brothers and sisters. So with that said, we gratefully acknowledge the native peoples who have lived on this land for millennia, especially the Selis and the Calypsi peoples, whose traditional lands are here in the heart of what we now call the Missoula Valley. Their dedication to the land and their communities runs deep within the hearts of those past, present, and future. This dedication encourages the Lewis and Clark Trail Heritage Foundation, Travelers Rest Connection, and others to continue developing among diverse communities an understanding of and appreciation for the commitment of the native people to this nation and the significance of the Lewis and Clark expedition. So with that said, let me now introduce our speakers here today. Most of us who are present this morning know that there are many mysteries and unanswered questions pertaining to the Lewis and Clark expedition and the individuals associated with that journey. No particular mystery is greater than the circumstances of the unfortunate death of Captain Meriwether Lewis in the fall of 1809. For years now, many individuals have debated the issues surrounding the death of Captain Lewis. Was he the victim of murder, or did he die by his own hand? Recently, 2 longtime members of this foundation have weighed in with their own perspectives on this difficult question. Today's presenters, David Peck and Marti Peck, recently published a book, So Hard to Die. A physician and a psychologist explore the mystery of Meriwether Lewis's death. This morning, Dave and Marti will present a summary of their findings and conclusions for us. Dr. David Peck is a native of Santa Barbara, California, but he has roots here in Montana as his mother was born and raised in our state capital, Helena. He earned his bachelor's and master's degrees in biology and secondary education from Arizona State University. After teaching high school biology in Arizona for about 4 years, his passion for science and for medicine led him to return to academia. And he received his medical degree as DO in 1987 from Western University of Health Sciences College of Osteopathic Medicine of the Pacific. He was board certified in family medicine and practiced in the field of urgent care for 21 years. David has served on the board of directors of this foundation, and many of you probably know he is also the author of another book, Or Perish in the Attempt, The Hardship and Medicine of the Lewis and Clark Expedition, that was published in 2011. This book was later developed into a documentary on Montana Public Television in 2016. David has presented on Lewis and Clark issues to many audiences across the country, including the famous Chautauqua Institute of New York. Dr. Marti Peck is a native of Pennsylvania. She earned her BA in psychology and eventually went on to earn her master's degree in counseling psychology and her PhD in clinical psychology. She has also completed 8 years of postdoctoral study in adult psychoanalysis and has been certified by the American Psychoanalytic Association in this specialty. In addition to being in private practice for over 30 years, she was a senior faculty member at the San Diego Psychoanalytic Center and instructed first-year medical students in the psychological aspects of medical practice. She did this from 2013 to 2016 as an adjunct professor at the University of California, San Diego. On the format for today's program, David and Marti will make their remarks, and at the conclusion, we will entertain questions from the audience. And I emphasize questions. Those who are interested in engaging the Pecks further on a more intensive level, whether by comment or criticism, are invited to do so after today's program. And with that being said, I'm told that Dr. Marti Peck will lead off the conversation. So, Marti, turn the microphone over to you. I'll get my laptop out of the way.
Thank you so much, Bill. Can everyone hear me in the back? And okay? We feel so honored to have been invited to speak to you all today and to have in the audience other Lewis and Clark authors and historians whose works we have read and admired over many years, as well as so many long-term members of the Lewis and Clark Trail Heritage Foundation. We realize that the topic we will be talking about today is not a pleasant one. Every one of us here today admires and respects Meriwether Lewis and all that he contributed in his full but relatively short life. I think it would be true to say that we would all love to get to the bottom of the mystery of Lewis's death. We want nothing more than to know what the real truth is about the cause of his death. We wrote our book, So Hard to Die, because over the years we had read many different ideas and theories about how Lewis died, but none, we felt, really addressed the issues with the specific medical and psychological training and experience that we had to offer. Our hope is that if there is something positive that can come out of the tragedy of Lewis's death, it would be to contribute some relatively new information for your consideration to the existing literature on this subject through the lenses we have as a psychologist and a physician. We titled our book So Hard to Die because these were the words Lewis was reported to have uttered as he lay dying. And he said, quote, "I am no coward, but I am so strong. It is so hard to die." You may recall that Clay Jenkinson wrote in his book, The Character of Meriwether Lewis, that when in describing grizzly bears in his journals, Lewis also wrote about the grizzly bears that they were so hard to die. We hope that as you listen, you will note any questions you may have, and we would be happy to answer them at the end of the presentation. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for coming. We really think this is a great pleasure to be here. We love talking about Lewis and Clark. I do it to a number of different groups in the San Diego area and around the country, and it's just always so much fun. My talks about medicine in Lewis and Clark are very exciting and are a happy topic. And as Marty noted, today's topic is really not a happy topic. But what we were trying to do here is, through the years and my reading of other authors' works on the death of Meriwether Lewis, sometimes I think that physicians and historians think in different ways. And sometimes there's a non-connect, I think, between those two worlds. What we really tried to do was address the medical issues from a point of view of medical science and psychological science, and give our findings about what we think happened. And I will do my best not to talk in any medical leads so that you're not understanding what I say. And if there's anything that we cover that you either don't understand, disagree with, please get your questions in your mind and give us your best shot as far as questions. I understand somebody in the past talked about Lewis's death and said, this is what I think, and I'm not going to take any questions. So that's not going to happen here. So we encourage you to come up with questions regarding what we have presented. This is not a crowd that I need to spend much time on the specifics of the expedition and what happened here and what happened there. So just for maybe a few people in the audience, we'll just give a very general background and a very brief background to lead into Lewis's life and to some of the issues that were involved in his death. So Thomas Jefferson is serving as the third president of the United States. He moves into the president's house in Washington, D.C., and issues an invitation to Meriwether Lewis to come out of the Army and come and be his personal secretary. So pretty closely after the time he arrives in Washington, D.C., Jefferson starts talking to him about this expedition into the western wilderness. And in 1803, the United States pretty much doubles in size with the acquisition of the Louisiana Territory from France. And the reason we got that is probably due to a medical reason, and that's because France and Bonaparte figured that they're not going to be able to keep possession of that anyways, because their entire army got wiped out by yellow fever in the Caribbean, and they figured they're not going to be able to defend this, so they might as well sell it to the Americans. And we ended up with 827,000 square miles for $15 million, which is probably the best land deal in the history of the world. Now, Lewis and Clark, they were gone for 28 months. Their journey covered over 8,000 miles, and they encountered over 50 American Indian tribes. They had all kinds of medical problems, and only one guy died. It's just, as we all know, this is our favorite story and what we really enjoy hearing about. But unfortunately for Lewis, when they returned to civilization in on September 23rd, 1806, to St. Louis, things did not start to go as well as they did for him during the expedition, for which he was an amazing, amazing commander. Now, by 1809, only 3 years after his return, on his way to Washington, D.C. to try to clear up problems he was having with the federal government, which we'll cover a little bit more on a little bit later, and he ends up on the Natchez Trace in present-day Tennessee, where he dies on October 11th, 1809, and therein begins the controversy, which we'll spend most of our time today. This was a picture, obviously, near Hohenwald, Tennessee. It's kind of a funny story. We got here, and this is the first time we ever got to this place. We traveled 2/3 of the way across the country to see Meriwether Lewis's gravesite, and we happened to end up there on a day when the federal government had shut everything down. And we got here to this place, and all these boards are out on the deal, you know, you can't park, nobody here. So anyways, we drove into Hohenwald, which wasn't too far away from here. And there was a police car there. And I got out, and my dad was a police captain, so police don't really scare me too much. And I walked up to this police officer, and he sees this, you know, old gray-haired guy. And I said, "Excuse me, sir." I said, "I'm from San Diego, and I love Meriwether Lewis. And we were just down there, and we saw that it's all blocked off and closed." And he's looking at me, and I looked at him. I says, "If we go down and go in there, are you going to arrest me?" And he looks, and he goes, "Well, maybe." So we turned around and went down, and we parked, and we were the only people in the park, and we didn't get arrested. So the works on Meriwether Lewis's life and death in modern days kind of arbitrarily start with Richard Dillon's biography, which Steve Ambrose praised as a great biography, but this was kind of when, is it murder or suicide, started to become forefront. And Dillon wrote that Jefferson tended to damn Lewis as an insane suicidist. Is it likely that the cause of Lewis's death was self-murder? Not at all. If there was such a person as the anti-suicide type, it was Meriwether Lewis. By temperament, he was a fighter, not a quitter. Sensitive he was, neurotic he was not. Now, Vardis Fisher published a book that was covered by Clay and one of his colleagues on a Thomas Jefferson Hour, which I really, really enjoyed listening to. And it's an interesting book because he supported the murder theory, and in his support of that, he completely ignored the written record of Lewis's alcohol abuse treatment at Fort Pickering, which is a common theme which we're going to return to today. He also stated that Jefferson's reports on Lewis could not be trusted because Jefferson had an affair with a married woman in France. And that was an interesting discussion that they had on air about that issue, and this is a kind of convoluted logic which we kind of had some trouble following, but that was Vardis Fisher's position on the murder-suicide controversy. So Clay, in actually one of my favorite books, called The Character of Meriwether Lewis, supports the suicide theory and gives a detailed analysis of Lewis and critiques various murder theories. David and Marti, in his book River of Promise, raised the interesting possibility of PTSD being present in Meriwether Lewis, and if that could account for some of the problems that he had after his return to society. Steve Ambrose, of course, in the mega popular Undaunted Courage, supported the suicide theory and the authenticity of the historic written record from Jefferson, Clark, and others regarding Lewis's mental condition and alcohol abuse. Patricia Stroud, in probably one of the more recently published examinations of Lewis's life and death, she supported the murder theory in part by denying Lewis's alcohol abuse and challenging the authenticity of William Clark's letter referencing Lewis's mental state. And this is also a common thread that runs through some of the murder supporters' theories, that they challenge the authenticity, the historic authenticity of these different letters. Excuse me. So the letter that she challenged by William Clark was written on 10/28/1809, about 2 weeks after Meriwether Lewis died. And it said, "I fear this report has too much truth. I fear the weight of his mind has overcome him." And Stroud stated in her book that this original letter has never been located and exists only in a copied form, with the implication being a conspiracy in favor of the murder theory. The only problem is that letter does exist, and last month we went to the Filson Historical Society and met with Jim Holmberg, the curator of the Filson, and he pulled the letter out and showed us, and there's me holding with the original Clark letter of that quote, and here's a close-up of it. You can see here Clark's writing, I fear the weight of his mind has overcome him, what will be the consequence, etc. And so that That is an issue of importance, obviously, in what we're covering today. Now, through the years, there have been all kinds of different theories proposed, and we're going to touch on all of these. Our book goes into all of these in some detail, and some of them we don't have time to cover at all, and others will kind of hit the highlights. But syphilis has been mentioned. You know, did he have tertiary syphilis that was causing his reported mental derangement? Malaria became a big thing within the last 15 years, and we'll cover some of that as the talk goes. Mercury poisoning has been raised by some, possible depression or bipolar illness. His mother's reaction, people said, well, his mother never accepted the idea that he committed suicide. And his mother, if she knows him better than anybody, how could anybody believe that he committed suicide? So we will cover that today. Clark and Jefferson's reaction. Now, this has caused a lot of heat within our community over the years, and we've touched on a little bit of it already, but you know, these are the two guys that knew Meriwether Lewis the best, and they both accepted the idea that he had committed suicide. Now, the first thing we want to look at today is just 5 medical issues that we want to mention and whether or not these actually had any bearing on Meriwether Lewis's death. And the first, because we're close to Traveler's Rest, we wanted to talk a little bit about mercury poisoning. Now, there's 3 different forms of mercury. There's elemental mercury, which maybe you had the opportunity to play with when you were a little kid. It's that silver stuff you hit and ran into all kinds of little balls. And if you were around it for too long, you can inhale the vapors, which are really toxic. So that's elemental mercury. In addition, there's inorganic mercury, which contains no carbon, which is what makes it inorganic mercury. And that is the type of mercury that was in a lot of the medicines in the medicine chest, like calomel and Dr. Rush's pills. And organic mercury is not mercury that was grown in a garden without any pesticides, but organic mercury is organic because it contains carbon atoms, and anything that contains carbon atoms in it is organic mercury. That is a particularly dangerous and toxic form of mercury because that will pass into your brain where it has a half-life of 20 years. So if you get mercury vapors into your brain, it's going to be there for a long, long time. And this is the type of mercury that was found in the ground at Traveler's Rest, which established the location of the latrine for the camp. So each has a different toxicological profile. Mercury poisoning. In the medicine box of the core, there were various forms of mercury. Some are readily absorbed into the body, and more so than others. All forms of mercury are toxic to living organisms. Our bodies are made out of largely carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, sulfur, potassium, things like that. Those are all elements, and they're put together by your body to form your muscles and everything else that functions within your body. We do not need any mercury. Any mercury. We don't have any mercury in our bodies that is functional. We probably all have some in our bodies because we maybe eat too much shark or too much swordfish, and those are the kinds of things in dietary people's diets that you can end up actually, if you eat too much of that, end up with some mercury poisoning. Now, the basis of mental derangement is if mercury can get into your brain. Now, this is a diagram of a blood cell that's inside of the brain. And it's really neat the way that the human brain is formulated because there is a so-called blood-brain barrier that keeps certain forms of mercury from moving from inside a blood vessel into the actual substance of the brain. It's called the blood-brain barrier. If you take calomel, like Dr. Rush's bilious pills, that stuff is going to pretty much go through you, and it's not going to get into your brain. If you breathe mercury fumes, either from elemental mercury or from organic mercury, that stuff can readily pass through that, and if you get enough of it, it can cause you to go insane and have mental derangement, just like Meriwether Lewis did. Now, if you look at inorganic mercury, again, calomel was a form of inorganic mercury, and it was the chief ingredient in Rush's pills. It does not cross the blood-brain barrier and thus does not cause the neurologic symptoms of damaging the brain. It is a potent irritant and toxic to the gastrointestinal tract and kidneys, which is why Dr. Rush developed it, because he believed that disease was either caused by or contributed to by constipation. And so his answer for that was to give somebody calomel, which would empty their intestinal tract out and, thereby, theoretically help them to get well from whatever ailed them. And he used Rush's pills for just about everything. And it was a horrible medication because not only was it toxic to your intestines, but also to your kidneys. It softens the gums, it causes you to lose teeth, and tissue death. So what makes calomel inorganic is that, again, it does not contain carbon. So here is a quick little diagram of a mercury ion, and this is a methyl group. So this is methyl mercury, and this is the stuff that was found in the ground at Traveller's Rest. Now, this form of mercury damages the brain as it passes easily from the bloodstream into the brain, where it attacks and destroys proteins. This results in erethism and insanity. It is organic, again, because it has carbon atoms attached to it, which aids its passage through the blood vessels into the brain. So where does methyl mercury come from? If you have an area that's a latrine at Traveller's Rest, and these poor guys are taking Rush's pills, what's coming out of them is an inorganic form. So how did they end up finding so much methyl mercury in the ground at Traveller's Rest? So microorganisms in the soil and water change elemental mercury into the organic form methyl mercury. And it's found in the food chain, especially in large fish that live in a long time, such as sharks, swordfish, and tuna. And elemental mercury deposited in the soil at the latrines of the Corps of Discovery, chiefly from inorganic mercury in Rush's pills, was transformed by bacteria of the genus Disulfovibrio in the soil that are called anaerobic bacteria because they operate in a pretty much oxygen-free area. So out goes the inorganic, and the microorganisms in the soil change it to an organic form. So I'm going to turn this back over to Marti for her introductory psychological observations of Meriwether Lewis.
My main contribution to our book concerns the psychological aspects of Meriwether Lewis, his probable mental state, his personality, and his psychology. Chapters 10, 11, and 12 of our book cover the psychological aspects of Lewis. In Chapter 10, Understanding Mental Health and Meriwether Lewis, I discuss, among other things, what the view was of mental illness during Lewis's lifetime and how such conditions were treated. For example, I talk about Dr. Benjamin Rush, the most famous physician in America during Lewis's lifetime, who lived in Philadelphia and was also a signer of the Declaration of Independence. He is now considered to be the father of American psychiatry. It was Dr. Rush who, in May of 1803, met with Lewis in Philadelphia to give him instruction on how to treat various medical conditions expected to occur on the expedition. He also developed the tranquilizing chair. It was believed in this historical era that quote-unquote madness was an arterial disease, an inflammation of the brain. This picture depicts this chair in which patients were confined, and it was supposed to control the flow of blood toward the brain, and by lessening muscular action or reducing motor activity, reduce the force and frequency of the pulse. It may be of interest to mention here the meaning of the term neurosis, which was first coined in 1769 by William Cullen, one of Rush's medical school professors at the University of Edinburgh in Scotland, to describe various disorders of the nervous system and symptoms that could not be explained physiologically. The meaning of this term has evolved over time and understood as a relatively more complex concept in our modern times, but perhaps more could be said about this later. In Chapter 11, a psychological interview with Meriwether Lewis, I conduct an initial consultation session with Lewis similar to one I would do with any new patient who came into my office to seek mental health treatment. And this is neither me nor Meriwether Lewis, by the way, full disclosure. This interview is imaginary but factual because I base it upon things Lewis actually wrote about himself, as well as what others who knew him wrote about him. I also interview William Clark and conduct a second interview of Lewis after his arrival at Fort Pickering on September 15, 1809. In Chapter 12, I create a psychological profile of Lewis based on the information I have obtained from him during my interviews with him. I use as my template the Psychodynamic Diagnostic Manual, 2nd edition, or the PDM-2. This manual is used by mental health clinicians with a psychoanalytic orientation to treatment that is similar to mine. One of the co-editors of the PDM-2, Nancy McWilliams, a psychologist, reviewed my chapters. I was very pleased that she, who is the co-editor of the PDM-2, made a significant contribution to ensuring the accuracy of the information I presented. In understanding Lewis's personality, it is important to know what some of the factors were that shaped it. A sampling of some of the highlights of these are that Lewis was born at Locust Hill in August 1774, a plantation he inherited from his father, which is located in Albemarle County, Virginia. He was born into one of the largest landholding families in colonial America and was of the gentry class. His father died when Meriwether was 5, reportedly of pneumonia, and his mother, Lucy, remarried within the year. A fascinating story is told of a young Southern gentry boy who was bitten by a plantation goose and responded by hacking the goose to death with a toy sword. When the boy's father heard of this incident, he praised the lad, noting that the goose had violated his honor and thus deserved his gruesome death. Although this was not Meriwether Lewis per se, it is apparent to me that this type of attitude was displayed in Lewis's personality throughout his life. Meriwether's self-confidence and his wilderness skills were highly developed even as a child, as he went out hunting in the dead of night with his dogs, even in winter. Just before Lewis turned 18, his stepfather died, leaving his mother a widow with 4 children to raise, 2 of which were his full siblings and 2 step-siblings. In those days, the oldest male child inherited the estate of their deceased parent, so it was Meriwether who stepped up to the plate and ran the family plantation for the next 2 years. Lewis joined the Virginia militia at the age of 20, and soon thereafter transitioned into the U.S. Army, progressing in rank from an ensign and then to a lieutenant, and finally captain at the age of 26. All of these experiences developed self-confidence, a sense of personal honor and integrity, and physical and mental toughness that prepared Lewis to be able to perform at a high level when President Jefferson, who knew Lewis and his family as neighbors in Virginia, invited him to come to Washington to serve as his personal secretary at the age of 26. After 2 years in the White House, which was known then as the President's House, Lewis took command of the expedition to explore the newly purchased Louisiana Territory and onward to the Pacific coast, as we know. Following Lewis's return from the expedition, Jefferson appointed him to serve as governor of the Upper Louisiana Territory, and it was in St. Louis that he spent the last 1.5 years of his life, from roughly ages 33 to 35 before he left on that fateful trip to Washington, D.C., with the aim of clearing his name and settling financial conflicts with the federal government. Now I'd like to focus a bit more on details of Lewis's personality. One of the characteristics of Lewis that has been frequently written about to describe him is that he was an honest man. In fact, his best friend, William Clark, after Lewis's death, wrote, "I do not believe there was ever an honester man in Louisiana, nor one who had purer motives than Governor Lewis." Even Jefferson, who knew Lewis very well, stated about him after his death that Lewis had a fidelity to truth so scrupulous that whatever he should report would be as certain as if seen by ourselves. This is a strong confirmation of this characteristic in Lewis's personality from the two men who probably knew him best. I would describe Lewis's personality style as being obsessive-compulsive. What I mean by this is that individuals with these types of personalities are generally emotionally constricted and regimented. They tend to be excessively concerned with rules, procedures, order, organization, schedules, and may be excessively devoted to work and being productive. This is surely a description of Lewis and why he thrived on his military lifestyle, and this way of being was a very adaptive and good fit for him. And also why he was such a competent and skilled animal and plant taxonomist during the expedition. This activity allowed him to be meticulously organized, and this was a natural bent for him. Central to an obsessive-compulsive personality is a resistance to feeling out of control. When Lewis was giving and taking orders in the Army, and he was meticulously drawing and describing the plant and animal specimens, he was in control. Another feature about Lewis was his strong sense of honor and patriotism. Just as the young colonial boy, out of anger, killed the goose that bit him, Lewis exhibited anger on multiple occasions when his honor was challenged. We can see this during his court-martial early in his Army career in 1795, and on several occasions during the expedition in his interactions with various Native American tribes. For example, on his reconnaissance of the Meriwether River on the return trip from the Pacific coast, when he left a Jefferson Peace Medal around the neck of the Blackfeet Indian that was killed by one of the Fields brothers for attempting to steal their rifles and horses. And this is a photo of the two Medicine River fight site in northwestern Montana near Valier that looks probably the same today as it probably did then in 1806. In the same vein, Lewis's personality style helps to understand why he was poorly suited to his administrative role as governor of Upper Louisiana Territory, and why he had such difficulty in his interactions with his assistant, Frederick Bates. It was not that Lewis was incapable of fulfilling his job responsibilities. It was just that due to his regimented nature, when Bates opposed Lewis's direction at every turn, Lewis, who was accustomed to giving orders as an Army officer and having others comply without questioning him, would have experienced this non-compliance by Bates as highly intolerable. Lewis experienced a lack of control in the face of this constant opposition by his subordinate Bates, and only served to increase the frustration and anger he felt in this political position. This regimented tendency in an obsessive-compulsive personality style may best be illustrated by Bates's own description of Lewis in a letter he wrote to his brother. "How unfortunate for this man that he resigned his commission in the Army. His habits are altogether military, and he never can, I think, succeed in any other profession." It is also very relevant to note here something about Lewis's family history of mental illness. And it seems highly likely that he had a genetic predisposition to depression, as reported by Jefferson in one of his reports about Lewis, that he had noted that Governor Lewis had from early life been subject to hypochondriac affections. It was a constitutional disposition in all the nearer branches of the family of his name, and was more immediately inherited by him from his father. While he lived with me in Washington, I observed at times sensible depressions of mind. I estimated their course by what I had seen in the family. We know that according to Jefferson, Lewis suffered from hypochondriac affections. What does this term mean? Lewis' biographer Thomas Denisi defined this term as meaning abdominal pain related to malaria, and stated that this was Jefferson's meaning of the term when Jefferson wrote it in 1813. Michael Crosby, Lewis and Clark historian and medical reenactor, wrote a wonderful article in WPO in 2013 and presented his extensive research into the historical meaning of this term. He wrote that in 1621 it referred to an anatomy of melancholy. In 1661 to anxiety. In 1726 to disturbed motions of the spirit, irritable disposition of the nerves. And in 1814, a genus of diseases of the class neuroses, dejection of mind and apprehension of evil, more especially respecting health, with a melancholic temperament. Benjamin Rush wrote, in regard to hypochondriac fevers, that they were manifest by false opinions of the nature and danger of the disease under which the patient labors. So Crosby's article and Rush's writing indicates that Jefferson was referring to Lewis's problem of anxiety and depression, and not anything related to malaria or abdominal pain. In other words, what it meant when Jefferson wrote it in 1813 is exactly the same as it means today, a mental problem associated with anxiety and depression. So now I'll turn it back over to David to focus on the topic of bullets and how they kill.
For me, one of the most interesting areas and controversy in the Lewis death discussion I cover in a chapter called Bullets and How They Kill. And the question can be asked, is there anything concerning Lewis's death on which everyone agrees? Because you're starting to, obviously you're a Lewis and Clark sophisticated crowd, you know that there's a controversy here. So is there anything about which everybody agrees? And pretty much everybody agrees that he died as a result of gunshots on the morning of October 11th, 1809. So the reports were that he suffered 2 gunshots, one to his breast, somewhere around the breast, with an exit wound in his lower back, and one to his head. Now, this has raised all kinds of discussions, and so we're going to take a look at this. Now, this book edited by John Geiss, who was a history professor in Mississippi, is really interesting, and in here raises a philosophical point which I encountered when I was writing my portion of this book, and I think resulted in some of the disconnect between historians and physicians' thinking that I mentioned early on. John Geiss wrote, when asked about what was your best evidence that Meriwether Lewis did not commit suicide and was murdered. And he wrote, I think if I had to pick a single work to read, I'd read the article by Dr. Chenard. I think he does a wonderful job of destroying some of the arguments for suicide. So philosophically, let's dissect that comment a little bit, in that we have a history professor who is offering his medical opinion on a medical opinion, stating that he thinks it's a very good argument, that Dr. Chenard made about Lewis's gunshots that he suffered. Now, I have a little bit of a philosophical and professional issue with this comment, because I don't feel like I'm being arrogant or cruel. I just don't think that Dr. Geis was in a position to make professional judgments on the quality of medical opinions. So let's take a look at what Dr. Chenard said. So Dr. Chenard was a doc. He was an orthopedic surgeon. He was an influential member in the Lewis and Clark Trail Heritage Foundation. He founded the We Proceeded On journal. And in November of 1991, Chenard wrote an article and stated that what do the supporters of suicide think that the second shot to his torso would have done to his heart, lungs, aorta, and/or intestines? Lewis's slow death is totally unbelievable. Lewis would have been in dire shock and soon have bled to death or perhaps paralyzed from spinal cord injury. So during the coroner's jury in 1996, Dr. Geis cited this gentleman's opinion, medical opinion, as his best blue ribbon piece of evidence that Lewis could not have committed suicide in the way that it was described. Okay, so when we look at Dr. Chenard, we have to ask the question, was Dr. Chenard correct? So my experience in medicine raised a question mark in that orthopedic surgeons generally don't take care of gunshots to the thorax. So what I did is I went to experts that I knew, except for one at the end, who have over 200 years of combined treatment, diagnosis, and post-mortem examination on people who have suffered gunshots. The first one was Dale Carrison, who was a classmate of mine in medical school. He ended up being a board-certified, it's not behaving here. Okay, so Dale Carrison is board-certified emergency medicine doc. He ran the University of Nevada Las Vegas-based emergency medicine program, has taken care of, in his 35-year career, hundreds of gunshot victims, some of whom I could tell you and you'd know them right off the bat, which I'm not going to do. So Dale gives lectures to FBI classes about ballistics, and the title of his classes are Bullets Do the Darndest Things. Now, the second gentleman I contacted was my friend Anthony Leo, who's a general vascular surgeon and a medical director, medical examiner in Iowa. And he has a 40-year surgical career of trauma surgery, among other things, taking care of gunshot victims. The third was a Great Falls general vascular trauma surgeon named Dale Mortensen. The fourth is a forensic pathologist who has over 15,000 postmortem autopsies to his credit. Probably 20 to 30% of those he deemed as suicide victims. A lot of those were the result of gunshot. Glenn Wagner gave me his opinion about this. And finally, Jerry Francisco, who testified at the coroner's jury in 1996. I do not know him personally, but I read his testimony in the coroner's jury, and it was relevant to the issue. So I consulted these 5 guys who are, you can take their opinions to the bank. This is not conjecture, and these guys' opinions is based on are based on their vast medical experience in dealing with these kinds of gunshots. So Dale said that if Lewis wasn't struck in the aorta or vena cava or the pulmonary arteries or veins, he may well have survived for some time. This would include a kidney wound as long as it didn't sever the renal artery. So he's saying that Lewis could have survived as long as the bullet didn't penetrate a significant artery that would have caused him to bleed to death rapidly. Anthony Leo stated that any path that did not injure either the heart, aorta, or vena cava could certainly be expected to produce wounds that would be survivable to a period of 2 hours. There are multiple trajectories of the described fatal wound that would not have been immediately fatal as proposed by Dr. Chenard, as the bullet missed any major vessels. So here again, he's directly contradicting the testimony of Dr. Chenard. Dale Mortensen said this, what he said really perked my ears up. Lewis's wound did not hit any major arteries, and when he says, it doesn't even particularly surprise me that that happened. as there is a lot of room inside the chest and abdomen for a bullet to pass through and not hit a major artery. Now, these are some diagrams that I drew for or perish in the attempt, and if we assume that the bullet went in somewhere around the breast with an exit around the low back, we don't know which side it was on, and of course which side it was on would deem, possibly the injury to what was inside of it, inside that area. But it's interesting to kind of keep that in mind when we talk about the rest. Now, Jerry Francisco, during the coroner's jury, stated that there are certain wounds that by their very nature you say, that's got to be fatal, and that's got to be fatal within a relatively short period of time. One of the body would not necessarily be fatal rapidly because it's a function of what organs were damaged and how rapidly was the bleeding. Because the bleeding is going to be the cause of death. And it has to be a large vessel, and the bleeding to be rapid for death to be rapid. So this directly contradicted the testimony given by Dr. Geis during the coroner's jury, and Jerry Francisco said that, yeah, basically the implication here is that he could have survived for 2 hours. Now, during the coroner's jury, there was no cross-examination of any of these people offering medical testimony, which is another interesting thing which we may visit a little bit later on. Glenn Wagner, who has done war crimes investigations for the government, is a board-certified forensic pathologist. He was a medical examiner in San Diego, which is how I ended up knowing him. Glenn said the gunshots kill by exsanguination, and depending on what the bullet hits will determine how quickly you are going to bleed. Some folks felt that the 2-hour survival time, which Lewis reportedly had, would suggest that it was not a suicide. I'd have to disagree with that position. He could have very well survived 2 hours. Now, we have 5 ultra-qualified physicians with tremendous experience in dealing with gunshot wounds and forensic experience, and they all agree that Lewis could have survived his described wounds for 2 hours. So Dr. Geis's blue ribbon piece of evidence, the opinion of Dr. Chenard, is not accurate. This question comes up a lot during our presentations. People say, how could a guy shoot himself twice? And how could a guy like Meriwether Lewis, who was so adept, how could he have bundled his own suicide so badly? Well, he had a brace of pistols. Some people say, well, how could he shoot himself and then reload his pistol? Well, it was known historically that he had a brace or 2 pistols with him. So if we think about the possible sequence of the gunshot wounds, we could come up with first the shot grazed the skull, which would have caused a significant amount of bleeding because scalp wounds really bleed aggressively. And the second shot would be to the breast, or the opposite. The first shot to the breast, the second shot to the skull. Now, we don't know where the skull wound was. So in the second scenario, if we have the first shot to the breast and again to the second to the skull, the third one is if the first shot went through his head in some way, penetrated the cranium and went through the brain, that's lights out. I mean, there would never be a second shot because that would have been instantaneous death. So if the first shot went through his head, there would be no second shot and no survival time of approximately 2 hours. And that's a question we really don't know. Now, it would be interesting to go through all of the ballistics of all of these things, but these were low-velocity weapons. They shot a round ball. They're not shooting modern-day ammunition that is put out of the barrel at a high velocity. And so the resulting wounds from these lower-velocity pistols do less tissue damage as they pass through the body, and if they pass through anything solid inside of the body, than a high-velocity round. So I'm going to turn this now back to Marty, and she can talk some more about her very interesting findings.
I would like to conclude my remarks by painting what seems to me a realistic picture of the context of the events occurring during the last few months of Lewis's life. The beginning of the end for Lewis, in my estimation, was when Jefferson's second term as president ended and Madison's administration took over. With the transition from the old to the new came the loss of both emotional and financial support that Lewis had received from Jefferson's administration, and the gain of Madison's appointment of William Eustis as the new Secretary of War, who was described by his contemporaries, Senator, Congressman, and future Secretary of State Henry Clay, and Secretary of the Treasury Albert Gallatin as, quote, utterly incompetent in any field, unquote. Eustis began not only denying payment of vouchers Lewis submitted for administrative operational expenses for the territory, but informing him that Lewis would be required to repay these costs out of his own personal funds. It was nothing less than having the proverbial rug pulled out from under his feet. In addition to his problems with the federal government, in June 1809, Lewis's frustration with his assistant Bates reached the boiling point at a Masonic ball when Bates rose from the table after Lewis sat down at the same one. Lewis felt insulted and was outraged at this offensive behavior and called for Clark to intervene. A duel between Bates and Lewis was likely averted at this point in time. All of this stress and frustration culminated on his 35th birthday in August of 1809, when Lewis received what Stephen Ambrose called in Undaunted Courage, quote, a heart-stopping letter from Secretary of War Eustis, unquote, informing Lewis that no further bills would be paid by the government. The meaning of this to Lewis and the deep anger he must have felt at this news cannot be overestimated. It meant to him that if this decision was not challenged, he would become personally bankrupt. It meant that all of his years of dedicated and patriotic service were being met with a slap in the face. His integrity was being questioned. He was faced with the loss of his honorable reputation. Such circumstances were not to be borne. Lewis, being the man he was, saw no other choice but to leave St. Louis and travel to Washington, D.C. to clear his name and set affairs straight. The man was in an acute financial, professional, and personal crisis. Over the next 3 weeks, Lewis prepared to leave St. Louis, trying to put his affairs in order and pack up his belongings. Clark's concern about Lewis's mental state is illustrated in a letter to his brother Jonathan, a week before Lewis departed the city of St. Louis, when he wrote, his creditors, all flocking in near the time of his setting out, distressed him much, which he expressed to me in such terms as to cause a sympathy which is not yet off. If his mind had been at ease, I should have parted cheerfully. All of these stressors were made worse by the probability that Lewis had been drinking heavily. And now I'll turn it back over to David again to talk further about alcohol use in America during the lifetime of Meriwether Lewis.
So this led to Lewis's last journey on September 4th, 1809. And on Lewis's last journey, he stopped at Cape Girardeau and in Missouri, and he made a last will and testament on September 11th, 1809. And as he
Sorry about that. So between leaving St. Louis and arriving at Fort Pickering, the vessel Lewis was traveling on stopped at Cape Girardeau on September 11th, where he made out a last will and testament, leaving all of his earthly belongings to his mother. When he arrived at Fort Pickering on September 15th, he arrived in such a debilitated state that he had to be carried in on a stretcher and put under house arrest to be attended to by the fort's physician and the commanding officer, Gilbert Russell. The boatsman reported to Captain Russell that Lewis had attempted to kill himself twice en route from St. Louis to the fort, although we do not have any documented details about the way Lewis tried to commit suicide. This state of quote-unquote mental derangement was not caused primarily from the warm weather, although it may have contributed to it. It was not caused by a malarial fever, as David explains more thoroughly in another entire chapter of our book. What is most likely is that Lewis attempted to kill himself on the boat while in a state of alcohol intoxication, as it was reported by the boatman. It was during this approximately 2-week stay in Fort Pickering that Lewis was treated for mental derangement, as reported by Russell, due to his admitted, quote, free use of liquor. There can be no doubt in my mind but that Lewis was feeling highly anxious and depressed about his circumstances. He needed a way to feel better, to self-soothe these extremely painful and intense emotions he was experiencing. It is not uncommon at all for individuals who are depressed and highly anxious to self-medicate with alcohol. It works, at least in the moment, to numb feelings, to help one feel better. But alcohol is a depressant, not an antidepressant. And when used habitually in this manner to self-medicate depression, what happens, in fact, is that the person becomes more depressed over time and digs an even deeper hole than they were in the first place. And I think this is what happened with Lewis. Over a period of 10 days, Lewis was administered only a little white wine to help wean him off the hard liquor he had been drinking in order to help detoxify him. According to many studies, over 50% of all suicides are associated with drug and alcohol dependence. At least 25% of chronic alcohol and drug abusers commit suicide. But Lewis did not have the support systems or rehabilitation resources necessary to maintain his sobriety after he left the fort. What he had was a man accompanying him, James Neely, who was known to drink excessively himself. As Captain Russell wrote to Jefferson on January 31st, 1810, addressing Neely's failure to properly monitor Lewis, he wrote, "But after leaving this place, by some means or other, his resolution left him, and this agent, being extremely fond of liquor, instead of preventing the governor from drinking or putting him under any restraint, advised him to it, and from everything I can learn, gave the man every chance to seek an opportunity to destroy himself." After stopping at the Chickasaw Agency for a couple of days due to Lewis's illness, Lewis, his servant Pernier, and Neely's servant rode on to Grinder's Stand, where Lewis's life ended on October 11th, 1809. Okay, now, David.
So this whole issue of Lewis's potential alcohol abuse has been a hot button within the community of Lewis and Clark as well. And John Geiss, again in the book By His Own Hand, stated, "Where is the hard evidence that Meriwether Lewis was an alcoholic? Many writers echo the charge of alcoholism, but none point to credible evidence." Well, let's take a look at that. John Geiss also said, "I suggest to you it is not likely that he, Jefferson, would have put the expedition in charge of a person if he knew that that person had a history of alcoholism." And I would completely agree with his statement there, but the Meriwether Lewis of 1801 and 1802 was not the Meriwether Lewis of 1809 who the federal government was coming down on, promising to ruin his life. So that is a red herring, in my opinion. So let's take a real quick look at alcohol abuse in America, 1790 to 1830. This was the most eye-opening area of research that I did in my book because I had no idea what was going on in the United States as far as alcohol abuse during the adult years of Meriwether Lewis. In 1810, there was 14,000 distilleries making whiskey in the United States. In Rohrbaugh, in his great book, The Alcoholic Republic, reported unprecedented heavy drinking. There was routine use of hard liquor by early teens in the United States, and a quote from that time period said, "It is not uncommon to see a boy of 12 or 14 walk into a tavern in the forenoon to take a glass of brandy and bitters." The U.S. military hard liquor daily ration of 4 ounces of whiskey, if it was available, would have put anybody into a state of 2023 standards of legal intoxication for driving. I mean, if you drank 4 ounces of whiskey, you could very definitely be arrested for a DUI. But this was common practice in the U.S. military at that time. From 1790 to 1830, pure alcohol intake was 7.1 gallons a year, and from 1800 to 1830, at least the first 10 years of those are the last 9 years of Meriwether Lewis's life, it was even higher, nearly double today's rate. So all of this doesn't make Meriwether Lewis an alcohol abuser, but what does the historical record show? Lewis referenced the oceans of whiskey that were available to him in 1794 during the Whiskey Rebellion, when he joined the militia to go to Pennsylvania to help put down the Whiskey Rebellion. And this quote was from a letter that he wrote to his mother, so one must wonder about Meriwether Lewis's disclosing this to his mother and wondering if he's teasing her because she was a devout Methodist who would not have approved of such things. And you have to wonder what he had going on inside of his head, why he would report that to his mother. There were multiple references to his use of alcohol during the expedition and in the following 3 years. Now, there's no report that he partook of the whiskey that they took on the expedition excessively, but I mean, he made punch during the 4th of July at the Great Falls, and punch was not fruit juice. In 1805, that was a hard liquor drink that was produced by mixing whiskey, and in that case with hailstones at the Great Falls. In addition to that, he borrowed $49.50 from Clark to buy whiskey in October of 1808. And interestingly, an IOU that we found written on August 22nd, 1809. This is a copy of his IOU that we found in the Special Collections, University of Virginia Library in Charlottesville. This is dated a couple of weeks before he leaves St. Louis to make his trip back to Washington, D.C. This is an IOU that states, "I so acknowledge myself justly indebted to Isaac Miller the sum of $202.87½ for 8 barrels of whiskey, signed Meriwether Lewis." So before he leaves St. Louis, he's trying to bring his bills and his debts up to date, and he leaves this with William Clark, who ends up paying Isaac Miller this amount for 8 barrels of whiskey. So this doesn't make Meriwether Lewis an alcohol abuser, but it's becoming a more interesting story. So that is about 320 gallons of whiskey. Now, somebody might add, well, Lewis didn't buy that all for himself. I mean, you'd have to be kind of nuts to buy 320 gallons of whiskey for yourself. And were they possible personal presents for other people or supply for the Masonic Lodge? Because, again, during that time, especially on the frontier, as John Geis said, drinking was pretty remarkable. And, even in St. Louis, it's probably even more remarkable than it might have been on the East Coast. And could he have done this as government purchases for gifts to various Native American tribes? Well, this amount of whiskey confirms the fact that America was soaked in liquor during 1790 to 1830. And if it was for official use, why would Lewis sign an IOU for it with money that he did not have? And interestingly, the question could be asked, or the statement could be made, that Lewis didn't intend to use it all by himself. I would accept that. I mean, 320 gallons or more of whiskey is a whole lot for, again, for somebody to buy for their personal use. But how many of those 320 gallons, if kept by Lewis, would not represent a problem for him? If he kept 10 gallons for himself, would that represent a problem, or 10, or 20, or 50? Captain Russell also wrote to Jefferson on January 31st, 1810, "The facts in which you may yet be ignorant of, that his untimely death may be attributed solely to the free use he made of liquor, which he acknowledged very candidly to me after he recovered and expressed a firm determination never to drink any more spirits or use snuff again, both of which I deprived him of for several days and confined him to claret and a little white wine." This has been attacked, and this was attacked by a person during the coroner's jury in 1996, saying this is complete nonsense, that is not how even then that this kind of thing would have been treated. You don't take a person who's an alcoholic and give him more alcohol. Well, the person that gave that medical opinion is completely wrong. That is completely wrong. If you take somebody who is addicted to alcohol and you put them cold turkey, that can be a life-threatening problem. And in Benjamin Rush's writings, he repeatedly encourages physicians to wean alcohol-addicted people, whiskey-addicted people, off with beer and wine. And he has made comments in his writings that you can read that there were very happy results that occurred from this weaning process of doctors taking people off with beer and wine. So Russell also wrote to Jefferson, "But after leaving this place by some means or other, his resolution left him, and this agent, being extremely fond of liquor, instead of preventing the governor from drinking and putting him under any restraint, advised him to it, and from everything I can learn, gave the man every chance to seek an opportunity to destroy himself." So Thomas Jefferson, on an April 18th, 1810 statement to Gilbert Russell, writes, "We have all to lament that a fame so dearly earned was clouded finally by such an act of desperation. He was much afflicted, and habitually so, with hypochondria. This act was profoundly increased by the habit into which he had fallen and the painful reflections that would necessarily produce in a mind like his." So, a couple interesting things here. What's hypochondria mean? It does not mean abdominal pain caused by malaria. That is a fantasy. So the act of the habit into which he had fallen is what was the habit. This was also claimed to be a return of his malaria. And that is also a fantasy. It's very clearly that he was referring to probable alcohol abuse. So now we're going to go really quickly here. We're almost out of time. His mother's reaction. So we have his mother here, by the way, in the audience. So if I say anything wrong, please correct me. So several authors have made the argument that if his mother, who knew him better than anyone, never accepted the report of his suicide, why should anyone believe that he did? Well, Meriwether Lewis's mother was a devout Methodist. And Methodists were staunchly dedicated to Bible study, prayer, helping the poor, and fellowship with other Methodists. They condemned the recreational use of alcohol as well as membership in the Masonic Lodge. So Lewis, who is a master Mason, and he's drinking, this could not have been a source of happiness to his Methodist mother. So John Wesley was the founder of the Methodist denomination. So if we take a look and see what John Wesley taught and what undoubtedly Meriwether Lewis's mother adopted in her religious beliefs, in April of 1790, Wesley wrote that existing laws in England which considered suicide a felony were insufficient to prevent suicides, which had greatly increased. So there was a law that was proposed in England that Wesley supported, that every person, quote, lord or peasant, who commits suicide shall be hanged in chains publicly, which he believed, Wesley, would end the fury just as this practice had done in ancient Greece. So when you ask the question, Well, why would Meriwether Lewis's mother not have ever accepted the idea that he committed suicide? His death was reportedly alcohol-related, and a suicide was thought to be self-murder and was stigmatized by most of society and would have been shameful to his mother. As a devout Methodist, the pain of such an act would have been severe for Lucy. Now, really quickly, is it possible that Lewis's mental derangement was caused by mercury poisoning? Mental derangement caused by mercury would have been the result of mercury attacking specific chemical bonds in the substance of his brain, permanently altering those structures and function with a half-life, again, of 20 years. This condition would not be cured or reversed by a 10-day diet of claret wine administered by Captain Russell at Fort Pickering a few weeks before his death. Now, could Lewis's mental derangement have been caused by malaria or syphilis? Interesting questions. These are great infectious diseases, and we could give a couple-hour talk about this stuff, which would have, to me, been great. But if Lewis had cerebral malaria or tertiary syphilis, he could not have been traveling as he was and would not have been cured by a 10-day diet of claret wine at Fort Pickering. Cerebral malaria is invariably fatal and makes patients very sick, and they're not traveling on boats and on horseback. So Meriwether Lewis did not have cerebral malaria during his final days. He just couldn't have been carrying on the travel schedule that he had. But could Lewis's mental derangement have been caused by primary neurosyphilis, which is different than the tertiary? So this was brought up by Dr. Ravenholt some years ago, the idea that Lewis probably had syphilis. And that would be another great lecture, but primary neurosyphilis can occur during either primary or secondary syphilis. People with tertiary syphilis usually get this 15 to 20 years after they get infected, and only 30% of those people who are untreated will end up with tertiary syphilis. But primary or secondary syphilis happens much before 15 years, and it affects the cranial nerves that are coming out of the brain, specifically causing difficulty walking, speaking, eye movement, facial expression, taste, hearing, balance, headaches, forgetfulness, and personality changes. So, wow, you got Meriwether Lewis with some pretty profound personality changes. And could this have been primary neurosyphilis? The chances of this type of affecting Meriwether Lewis are less than 3% of primary syphilis. People that get primary syphilis are only 3% of those people. So undoubtedly, this is if you want to go with 97% odds, he did not have primary neurosyphilis. And victims have neurologic complications, and again, he would not have been cured by a 10-day diet with claret wine at Fort Pickering. So with this situation, we have Meriwether Lewis now going on, and with all of these situations as we have described, we got to say, was this murder or suicide? So some people have called out General Wilkinson's involvement. Wilkinson was a bad guy. Teddy Roosevelt called him something to the effect of the worst American in the history of the country. Is that close, Clay? I mean, he was a bad guy. He was a paid spy for Spain and not a good guy. And there have been people who have written entire books that General Wilkinson was behind the murder of Meriwether Lewis. But there's no evidence for that. And people have said, well, if this letter existed, then it would show that. But that letter doesn't exist. So it's an interesting possibility. And other people have said the Natchez Trace is a dangerous route. Our friend Tony Turnbow, who's an attorney in Tennessee, thinks that Lewis was murdered, and in part because Natchez Trace was such a dangerous route. Supporters of the murder theory must either ignore or deny all of the following facts regarding Lewis's death. The first being, Jefferson and Clark both believed that Lewis had suicided, with numerous others reporting on his poor state of health. Lewis's personality and mistreatment by the Madison administration are the key to understanding his despair and his alcohol abuse. The evidence against suicide is almost entirely untrue or misrepresented. Clay wrote a really nice synopsis of Geiss's 40 reasons why suicide would not be correct or not possible, and Dr. Geiss said that all of the suicide evidence is easily or readily countered. Only 2 of those 40 I agreed with, and that was an exhumation should happen, and the other was he died as a result of gunshots, I think. But all of the rest of the stuff that was written, to me, is not true on medical basis. The claim made by Dr. Geis that all the evidence of suicide is readily countered, again, is not true. And moving on, claims that important historical records are either forged or do not exist, such as Clark's letter, are not true. There is no evidence of any conspiracy to kill Lewis. There is a wealth of historical records as well as sound medical analysis that supports all of the factors which contributed to Lewis's depression and the despair at the end of his life. Almost all of the published theories, malaria and syphilis that involve medicine and psychological aspects, the final days of Lewis deviate significantly from established medical science and the historical record. And a significant amount of the medical testimony given at the coroner's jury in 1996 is not true and was given by non-physicians who were not experts. So I'll just turn this over to Marty, and we are about done.
We just wanted to share some of the photos of some of our travels and doing the research for our book. Unfortunately, the head of the curator of the American Philosophical Society is cut off in the first picture on the top left side, but we were there in October of 2021 and got to view the original journals of Lewis and Clark that are archived there. On the bottom left side is David with Jane Lewis Henley, Meriwether Lewis's 4-time great-grandniece, in the cemetery at Warner Hall, where some of the original Lewis ancestors are buried. And then me on the right at the Lewis Monument in Hohenwald, Tennessee. On the left side here is the Special Collections Director at the Athenaeum in Philadelphia, where Lewis's telescope that he used on the expedition is housed. In the center is me standing next to the original Charles Wilson Peale portrait we always see of Lewis in the Historic District in Philadelphia. And on the right is David at the gravesite of Benjamin Rush in the Christ Church Cemetery in Philadelphia.
So, in ending this up, we want to give special thanks to Michael Haynes, we used a couple of his art pieces, as well as Jim Holmberg, the curator of the Filson Historical Society in Louisville. I learned how to pronounce that when I was there. My friends, Drs. Karrison, Leo Mortensen, Wagner, and Francisco and Nancy McWilliams, PhD. That picture is of me when I was 4 years old at my grandfather's farm in East Helena. And when we came across that, Marty looked at that and goes, that's when this all started. So we thank you all for your attention and hope that you got something out of our presentation. And we invite you to contact us through our website, lewisandclarkmedicine.com. You can email us there. There's contact information if you want to discuss something. I'll be glad to discuss it with you via email. And we thank you for your attention and interest, and we wish you all happy trails.